I told him, "My mom had a ring just like that." And the millionaire's smile disappeared instantly. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read. Anger? Fear? Regret? I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, even though it was the middle of a sweltering August afternoon in Manhattan. Maybe you're serving tables for people who don't appreciate it, or cleaning up after everyone else has left. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The smell of strong coffee and buttered toast hung in the air at the Gilded Lily, mixing with the sharp scent of cleaning solution I'd been using all morning. My name is Margaret, though most people just call me Maggie, and I've been a waitress for 37 years. 37 years of smiling when my feet ached. 37 years of pretending not to hear the cruel comments. 37 years of being invisible to everyone except when they needed something. At 57, my hands tell the story of my life, calloused from carrying trays, stained from wiping down tables, scarred from the occasional broken glass. My uniform, a crisp white blouse and black skirt, was always perfect, even when I felt like falling apart inside. The managers at the Gilded Lily demanded perfection from you servers. We were the face they wanted customers to see, but never the person they cared to know. Every morning, I'd wake up at 4:30 in my small studio apartment in Queens. The radiator would clank and hiss, and I'd make my coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for 15 years, my mother's mug. The subway ride into Manhattan took an hour and 20 minutes on good days, longer when there were delays. I'd stand pressed against strangers, watching the city wake up through dirty windows, counting the stops until I reached my station. The Gilded Lily sat on the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The kind of place where a single breakfast could cost more than I made in 2 days. Rich businessmen would sit at our tables, discussing million-dollar deals while I refilled their coffee cups. They talked about their stock portfolios, their real estate investments, their Bitcoin holdings, as if I didn't exist. Sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to have that kind of wealth, that kind of power, to never worry about making rent or buying groceries. My manager, Lisa, was a woman in her early 40s who wore her authority like armor. She'd snap her fingers when she wanted my attention, as if I were a dog. "Table 12 needs more water," she'd bark. "The gentleman at table 5 is still waiting for his eggs, Benedict." Never please. Never thank you. Just orders. Delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. The other servers, and I, Carmen, Valerie, and Beth, had formed our own little family of survival. We'd steal moments in the supply closet to share stories about difficult customers, or to simply catch our breath. Carmen was saving money to bring her mother from Honduras. Valerie was putting herself through nursing school. Beth was supporting her disabled husband. We were all fighting our own battles, but we fought them together. The customers rarely saw us as people. We were props in their expensive meals, invisible hands that brought food and cleared plates. I'd learned to read their moods quickly. The businessman who'd been drinking since 10 in the morning would be mean to everyone around him. The society woman who lunched with her friends would send her salad back 3 times, claiming it wasn't fresh enough. The young couple on their first date would be so focused on impressing each other that they'd forget to tip. But it was the regulars who hurt the most. Mr. Patterson came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and a plain bagel with cream cheese. For 3 years, I'd served him with a smile, remembered exactly how he liked his coffee, even asked about his week. But he'd never once looked me in the eye or called me by name. To him, I was just the coffee lady. Then there was Mrs. Henderson, an elegant woman in her 70s who came in for Sunday brunch with her adult children. She'd always request me specifically, praising my service to the other servers. But when her son would make cruel jokes about the help, or when her daughter would snap at me for bringing the wrong kind of jam, Mrs. Henderson would just sit there silently. She never defended me, never acknowledged that I was a human being deserving of basic respect. The kitchen was its own world of chaos. Steam would billow from the industrial dishwashers. The line cooks would shout orders in Spanish and English, their voices mixing with the clatter of pans and the hiss of grills. Jose, the head cook, was one of the few people in that place who treated me with genuine kindness. He'd always make sure I got a proper meal during my break, sometimes slipping me leftovers to take home. His own paycheck wasn't much bigger than mine, but he understood what it meant to work with dignity in a place that didn't always respect it. My feet would be screaming by hour 6 of every shift. The anti-fatigue mat behind the coffee station provided little relief. I'd developed plantar fasciitis from years of standing on hard floors, but I couldn't afford to take time off for physical therapy. Some nights I'd go home and soak my feet in warm water with Epsom salt, the only luxury I could afford. The uniform itself was a constant reminder of my place in their world. The white blouse had to be pristine, not a wrinkle, not a stain. The black skirt had to hit exactly at my knees. My hair had to be pulled back in a neat bun. My makeup had to be professional, but not too bold. I was performing a role, playing a character of the perfect invisible server. But underneath that costume was a woman with dreams, fears, memories, and a life that mattered. I'd been wearing my mother's ring for as long as I could remember. It was a simple silver band with a small Celtic knot engraved around the center. Nothing expensive or flashy, but it connected me to her memory. She'd worked as a seamstress her whole life, her fingers always busy with thread and fabric. When she passed away 10 years ago, the ring was one of the few things she left behind. Wearing it made me feel like she was still with me, especially during the hardest days. The gilded lily attracted a certain type of clientele: entrepreneurs, real estate moguls, tech giants visiting from Silicon Valley, men and women who'd built fortunes through clever investments, aggressive business tactics, and sometimes sheer luck. They'd discuss their assets over Eggs Benedict, argue about cryptocurrency trends while sipping $20 mimosas. Their conversations were a constant reminder of the gulf between their world and mine. One particular morning in August, the restaurant was buzzing with an unusual energy. Word had spread that Cameron Hayes, one of the youngest billionaires in tech, was coming for brunch. The staff was on edge. Lisa had been barking orders all morning, making sure every surface gleamed and every uniform was perfect. The kitchen staff had prepared special dishes not on the regular menu. Even the other servers seemed nervous, whispering about the enormous tips billionaires supposedly left. I'd heard of Cameron Hayes, of course. His face had been on magazine covers and business news shows. He'd built his fortune developing artificial intelligence software that major corporations used to streamline their operations. The financial press loved to write about his investment portfolio: tech stocks, real estate developments, even significant holdings in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. At 34, his net worth was estimated at over $2 billion. He was the kind of person who could buy our entire restaurant without feeling it in his budget. When he arrived, the energy in the room shifted immediately. Conversations became quieter, as if people were trying to catch pieces of whatever important business he might discuss. He was shorter than I'd expected, maybe 5'8", with carefully styled brown hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. His smile was practiced, the kind that had been refined through countless business meetings and media interviews. He chose the corner table, table 15, which offered the most privacy and the best view of the restaurant's main dining room. Lisa personally escorted him to his seat, her usual sharp demeanor replaced by an almost servile politeness that made my stomach turn. She gestured for me to handle his table, probably thinking that the most experienced server should take care of such an important guest. As I approached with the water pitcher and menus, I could feel the weight of attention from other tables. People were pretending not to stare, but phones were discreetly positioned to capture photos. Some diners were probably already posting on social media about spotting him. The pressure to provide perfect service was immense. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," I said, filling his water glass with steady hands despite my nerves. "Welcome to the Gilded Lily. Can I start you with our signature coffee blend, or perhaps some fresh orange juice? His smile was charming, but there was something calculating behind his eyes. Coffee would be perfect, and I'll take a look at your champagne selection. I'm celebrating a particularly successful week in the markets. He gestured casually, but I caught the gleam of an expensive watch on his wrist. My cryptocurrency investments alone generated more profit this week than most people see in a lifetime. I nodded politely, used to customers who felt the need to broadcast their wealth. Of course, sir. I'll bring the champagne list right away. As I turned to walk back to the server station, my mother's ring caught a beam of sunlight streaming through the restaurant's large windows. The Celtic knot seemed to shimmer for just a moment. It was such a small thing, but it gave me a moment of comfort in what was otherwise a tense situation. When I returned with his coffee and the champagne menu, Cameron Hayes was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones about stock options and dividend yields. I waited patiently, as I'd been trained to do, until he finished his call and looked up at me with that practiced smile. "The Cristal," he said, pointing to the most expensive bottle on the list. "And I think I'll have the lobster eggs Benedict with caviar. Make sure the kitchen knows I prefer my eggs slightly runny." He handed me the menu with barely a glance in my direction. As I took the menu from him, the ring on my finger brushed against his hand for just a second. He glanced down, and I watched his expression change. The casual arrogance in his eyes sharpened into something more focused, more intense. He stared at my ring for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. "That's an interesting piece of jewelry," he said, his voice suddenly cooler than it had been moments before. I looked down at my hand, suddenly self-conscious. "Oh, this. It was my mother's. Nothing fancy, but it means a lot to me." His smile faltered slightly. "Your mother's, you said?" "Yes, sir. She passed away 10 years ago. But wearing this makes me feel like she's still with me somehow." I was trying to keep my voice professional, but talking about my mother always made me emotional. "My mom had a ring just like that," I said, gesturing toward his own hand. "That's when everything changed." The practiced smile disappeared from his face entirely. His eyes went cold, and for a moment he looked almost frightened? Angry? I couldn't quite read the expression, but it made my skin crawl. The air between us suddenly felt heavy, electric with tension I didn't understand. "I doubt that very much," he said, his voice now sharp enough to cut glass. "This ring is one of a kind, custom made by a jeweler in Switzerland. Cost more than most people make in a year." He held up his hand, showing off a silver band that was, I had to admit, remarkably similar to the one my mother had left me. But his had additional engravings, tiny diamonds set into the Celtic pattern, and an overall weight and quality that my simple band lacked. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to imply that my ring was as valuable as yours. I just meant the design looks similar. My mother always said it was Celtic, passed down through her family." But Cameron Hayes wasn't listening to my explanation. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at my ring with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. Other tables were starting to notice the tension. The conversations around us had grown quieter, and I could feel Lisa's sharp gaze from across the room. "Where exactly did your mother get this ring?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something dangerous in his tone. I'm not entirely sure," I stammered. "She said it belonged to her grandmother, and her grandmother before that. It's been in our family for generations." I twisted the ring nervously around my finger, suddenly wishing I hadn't mentioned it at all. Cameron Hayes leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving my face. "What was your mother's name?" The question caught me off guard. Eleanor Murphy, before she married my father. "Sir, is everything all right? Can I get you anything else?" The color drained from his face completely. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decode. Fear? Guilt? Recognition? The silence stretched between us until it became unbearable. Finally, he spoke. His voice barely audible. "Eleanor Murphy from Boston?" My heart skipped a beat. How could he possibly know that? "Yes, sir, but how did you—" "She used to work for my grandmother," he said slowly, as if each word was being dragged out of him against his will. "Back in the 1960s, she was the housekeeper." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd known my mother had worked as domestic help when she was young, before she met my father. But she'd never mentioned working for wealthy families, and she'd certainly never mentioned anyone named Hayes. I felt the room spinning slightly, my professional composure beginning to crack. "I don't understand," I managed to say. "What does this have to do with my ring?" Cameron Hayes' face hardened again, the moment of vulnerability disappearing behind his billionaire mask. "Nothing at all," he said coldly. "I was mistaken. Just bring me my food and let's forget this conversation ever happened." But I couldn't forget it. The way he'd looked when I mentioned my mother's name, the shock in his eyes when he saw the ring, none of it made sense. And something in his tone when he'd mentioned her working for his grandmother felt wrong, incomplete. "Sir, if my mother worked for your family, I'd love to know more about—" I said forget it. His voice was sharp enough to cut and loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look. "Just do your job and bring me my food." The dismissal stung worse than any rude comment I'd endured in 37 years of serving. This felt personal, cruel in a way that went beyond mere customer rudeness. I nodded stiffly and walked away, my hands shaking as I entered his order into the computer system. Carmen caught me at the coffee station, her dark eyes full of concern. "Maggie, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I lied, my voice barely steady. "Just a difficult customer." But I wasn't fine. Something about that interaction had shaken me to my core. The way Cameron Hayes had reacted to my mother's name, the fear in his eyes when he'd looked at my ring, it felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed, and his quick retreat into coldness afterward suggested he was hiding something significant. When I brought him his lobster eggs Benedict 20 minutes later, he didn't look up from his phone. He ate in silence, occasionally taking sips of the ridiculously expensive champagne. I refilled his water glass twice. And each time he acted as if I didn't exist. The warmth and charm he'd shown initially had been replaced by an icy indifference that felt almost hostile. Other servers started giving his table a wide berth. Word had spread that something had gone wrong between the famous billionaire and me, and nobody wanted to get caught in the crossfire. Lisa kept shooting me warning glances from across the room, clearly annoyed that I'd somehow managed to upset such an important customer. As Cameron Hayes finished his meal, I approached with the leather check folder, trying to maintain my professional demeanor despite the turmoil in my chest. He signed the credit card receipt without looking at it, added what I assumed was a standard 20% tip, and stood to leave. But as he walked past me toward the exit, he paused. "That ring," he said quietly, so only I could hear him. "You should be careful wearing it. Some things are better left buried." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there with a check folder in my hands and 1,000 questions burning in my mind. The threat, because that's what it had felt like, echoed in my ears for the rest of my shift. Some things are better left buried. What did that even mean? The rest of that day passed in a haze. I served my other tables mechanically, going through the motions of smiling and taking orders while my mind raced with possibilities. What connection had existed between my mother and the Hayes family? Why had Cameron Hayes looked so frightened when he recognized her name? And what did he mean about things being better left buried? That evening, I rode the subway home in a daze, staring at my reflection in the dark windows and twisting my mother's ring around my finger. For the first time in 10 years, the ring didn't bring me comfort. Instead, it felt heavy, weighted with secrets I didn't understand. My studio apartment in Queens felt smaller than usual that night. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, but couldn't bring myself to eat. Instead, I sat at my small kitchen table and tried to remember everything my mother had told me about her past. She'd been born in Boston in 1943, the youngest of 6 children in a working-class Irish family. Her father had worked in the shipyards. Her mother had taken in laundry and sewing to make ends meet. Eleanor had left school at 16 to find work, helping to support her family during the difficult years after World War II. She'd never talked much about the jobs she'd held before meeting my father in 1968. I knew she'd worked as a seamstress in a factory and as domestic help for wealthy families, but she'd always spoken about those years vaguely, as if they were chapters she preferred to keep closed. Now I wondered what stories she'd been keeping from me. I pulled out the small wooden box where I kept her few personal belongings. There wasn't much: a rosary, some old photographs, her social security card, and a few letters from distant relatives. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was something I'd forgotten about: a small silver locket that had belonged to her. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of a young woman I'd never been able to identify. She looked to be in her 20s. With dark hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my mother. On the back of the photograph, in my mother's careful handwriting, were the initials M.H. and a date, 1965. M.H. Could that stand for Margaret Hayes? Was this a photograph of Cameron Hayes' grandmother, the woman my mother had worked for? I held the tiny photo under my kitchen lamp, studying the face for any resemblance to the billionaire I'd served that afternoon. The bone structure was similar, the same sharp jawline and intelligent eyes. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together fragments of memory and possibility. Why had my mother never mentioned working for the Hayes family specifically? Why had she seemed so reluctant to talk about her early working years? And why had Cameron Hayes reacted with such fear when he recognized her name? The next morning, I arrived at the Gilded Lily with dark circles under my eyes and questions I couldn't answer. The breakfast rush was particularly brutal: 3 large business meetings and a wedding brunch party that kept me running between tables for hours. But even in the chaos of service, I couldn't stop thinking about Cameron Hayes and his cryptic warning. During my break, I used my phone to search for information about the Hayes family. Cameron's Wikipedia page mentioned that he'd inherited his initial investment capital from his grandmother, Margaret Hayes, who had died in 2005. She'd been a Boston socialite, married to a real estate developer who'd built much of his fortune during the post-war housing boom. There were photos of her at charity galas throughout the 1960s and 70s, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by other wealthy Boston society figures. But there was no mention of household staff, no reference to the people who had worked behind the scenes to maintain her privileged lifestyle. People like my mother were invisible in the official histories of wealthy families. Their labor was essential but unacknowledged, their stories untold. That afternoon, as I was wiping down tables after the lunch rush, Lisa approached me with an expression I'd never seen before. Usually her face showed either annoyance or indifference. Today she looked almost nervous. "Maggie, I need to talk to you," she said, glancing around to make sure no other staff members were within earshot. "There's been a complaint filed against you." My heart dropped into my stomach. A complaint? About what? Yesterday's incident with Cameron Hayes. He called this morning to speak with management. Lisa's voice was artificially steady, the tone she used when delivering unpleasant news. "He claims you made inappropriate personal comments about his jewelry and tried to engage him in unwanted conversation about your family history." I felt like I'd been slapped. That's not what happened at all. He's the one who asked about my ring, who asked about my mother. I was just trying to be polite and answer his questions. "He also mentioned," Lisa continued, ignoring my protest, "that you seemed to be eavesdropping on his business conversations and showed excessive interest in his personal details." "That's completely false." I could hear my voice rising and I forced myself to lower it. Other servers were starting to notice our conversation. I never listened to his calls and I certainly wasn't trying to pry into his personal life. He's the one who— Maggie. Lisa's tone cut through my words. Cameron Hayes is worth $2 billion. He's the kind of client this restaurant depends on. His word carries infinitely more weight than yours. The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. After 37 years of professional service, after decades of putting up with rude customers and impossible demands, my reputation could be destroyed by one wealthy man's lie. Because that's what this was, a deliberate distortion of what had actually happened. "What does this mean for my job?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "You're suspended pending investigation," Lisa said, not meeting my eyes. "Turn in your apron and clear out your locker. We'll contact you in a few days with our decision." The words felt surreal. Suspended. After 37 years of loyal service, I was being sent home because I'd worn my mother's ring to work and answered questions a billionaire had asked me. The injustice of it made me dizzy. "Lisa, please. You know me. You know I would never do anything inappropriate with a customer. My record here is spotless." But Lisa was already walking away. "Clean out your locker, Maggie. Security will escort you out." The next 20 minutes were the most humiliating of my life. I had to pack my few personal belongings, a spare pair of shoes, some lotion, photos of my grandchildren, while my co-workers watched with mixtures of sympathy and fear. Nobody wanted to get too close, as if my disgrace might be contagious. Carmen squeezed my hand as I walked toward the exit. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everyone knows you didn't do anything." But knowing something is wrong and being able to fix it are very different things. As I walked out of the Gilded Lily for what might be the last time, I felt a piece of my identity cracking apart. I'd been a waitress for most of my adult life. It wasn't just my job, it was who I was. The subway ride home felt endless. I sat in the corner of the car, still wearing my work clothes but without the apron that had been my uniform for so many years. Other passengers avoided eye contact, perhaps sensing my distress. The city rushed by outside the windows, but I felt disconnected from it all, suspended in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. That evening, I sat in my apartment and tried to make sense of what had happened. Cameron Hayes had destroyed my career with a phone call, but why? What about our interaction had threatened him enough to warrant such a vicious response? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that his complaint wasn't really about inappropriate behavior. It was about silencing me before I could ask more questions about my mother and his grandmother. But what secrets could be so dangerous that a billionaire would go to such lengths to keep them buried? I spent the next 3 days in a strange state of limbo. Without work to structure my days, time seemed to move differently. I'd wake up at 4:30 out of habit, then remember I had nowhere to go. The financial pressure was immediate and terrifying. I lived paycheck to paycheck, with barely enough savings to cover 2 weeks of expenses. On the 4th day, Lisa called with the restaurant's decision. I wasn't surprised, but the words still hit like hammer blows. "We've completed our investigation," she said in her most official voice. "Given the serious nature of the complaint and the importance of maintaining customer confidence, we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." "What investigation?" I asked, though I knew it was pointless. "Did anyone actually interview me about what happened? Did you review the security footage?" "The decision is final, Maggie. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." And just like that, my career was over. 37 years of service, ended by a single phone call from a man who wanted to keep his family's secrets buried. But if Cameron Hayes thought that firing me would make me disappear quietly, he'd underestimated the stubborn Irish streak I'd inherited from my mother. Losing my job hurt terribly, but it also freed me from the constraints of professional politeness. I no longer had to smile and nod when wealthy people treated me poorly. I could finally ask the questions that had been burning in my mind. That afternoon, I took the subway back into Manhattan, not to the Gilded Lily, but to the New York Public Library. If I was going to learn the truth about my mother's connection to the Hayes family, I'd need to do some research. The library's newspaper archive section was quieter than the main reading rooms, filled mostly with graduate students and elderly people researching genealogy. I requested microfilm reels for Boston newspapers from the 1960s, starting with 1965, the year written on the back of the photograph in my mother's locket. Scrolling through decades-old newspapers was tedious work, but I was motivated by a growing anger at how I'd been treated. Page after page of society news, business announcements, and charity galas. The Hayes family appeared frequently in the social pages. Margaret Hayes at various fundraising events, often photographed in elaborate gowns and expensive jewelry. Then, in the October 15th, 1965 edition of the Boston Herald, I found something that made my heart race. It was a small item buried in the society section, just a few lines of text. Police were called to the Back Bay mansion of real estate magnate Robert Hayes following reports of a disturbance. Mrs. Margaret Hayes reported that jewelry worth approximately $50,000 had been stolen from her bedroom safe, including several antique rings passed down through the Hayes family. A member of the household staff is being questioned in connection with the theft, though no charges have been filed at this time. $50,000 in 1965 would be worth hundreds of thousands in today's money, and antique rings, family heirlooms that would have been irreplaceable. I felt sick as I realized what this might mean. Had my mother been the household staff member mentioned in this article? Had she been accused of stealing from the Hayes family? I kept searching, looking for any follow-up stories, but found nothing. No arrest records, no trial coverage, no resolution to the theft report. It was as if the story had simply been dropped. But I did find one more reference to my mother, this time in a different context. In the December 3rd, 1965 edition of the same newspaper, there was a small announcement. Eleanor Murphy, formerly employed by the Hayes household, has left Boston to pursue opportunities in New York City. The timeline made sense. My mother had met my father in New York in 1968, but she'd moved to the city 3 years earlier. She'd never told me why she'd left Boston, but now I was beginning to understand. She'd been accused of theft, and even if no charges were filed, the scandal would have made it impossible for her to find work with other wealthy families in Boston. She'd had to start over in a new city. But if she'd been innocent, and I couldn't believe my mother would ever steal anything, then someone else had taken that jewelry, someone who had been willing to let her take the blame. I thought about the ring on my finger, the one that had triggered Cameron Hayes' reaction. What if it wasn't just similar to his ring? What if it was part of the same set, pieces from the Hayes family collection that had supposedly been stolen in 1965? The possibility sent chills through me. If my mother had been falsely accused of theft, if she'd been forced to leave Boston under a cloud of suspicion, then no wonder she'd never talked about those years. The pain and humiliation would have been enormous. But how had she ended up with a ring from the Hayes collection? Had someone given it to her? Had she somehow acquired it legitimately? Or, and this thought made me sick, had she actually taken it? Not as theft, but as compensation for being wrongly accused and having her reputation destroyed? That evening, I called my cousin Patricia in Boston. She was my mother's brother's daughter, the keeper of family history and stories. If anyone might know about my mother's time working for wealthy families, it would be Patricia. "Maggie!" Patricia's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "How lovely to hear from you. It's been too long." After exchanging pleasantries about family and health, I carefully broached the subject that had been consuming my thoughts. "Patricia, I was wondering if you knew anything about Mom's work before she moved to New York. I know she worked for wealthy families, but she never talked about it much." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about that now, dear?" "Something happened at work that made me curious about her past. Did she ever mention a family named Hayes?" Another pause, longer this time. "Maggie, your mother made me promise never to talk about those days. She said some things were better left buried." The phrase hit me like an electric shock. Some things are better left buried. The exact words Cameron Hayes had used when he'd threatened me. "Patricia, please. I think this might be important. I think Mom might have been in some kind of trouble, and I need to understand what happened." "She wasn't in trouble," Patricia said firmly. "She was a victim. That family. They did something terrible to her, Maggie. Something she never got over." "What kind of terrible thing?" "I've kept this secret for 60 years, Patricia said, her voice heavy with old pain. "But maybe it's time the truth came out. Your mother was working as a housekeeper for the Hayes family in Boston. She was young, maybe 22, and she was saving money to get married and start her own life." I waited, holding my breath. "There was a son in the family," Patricia continued. "Margaret Hayes' son, Robert Jr. He was in his 30s, married with children of his own, but he had a reputation for bothering the help. Your mother tried to avoid him, but one night when his wife and parents were out of town..." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. "He attacked her?" I whispered. "She never used that word," Patricia said carefully, "but she came to stay with us for a few days afterward, and she was different, scared, ashamed. And then a week later, the family accused her of stealing jewelry. They said she'd taken expensive rings from Margaret Hayes' bedroom." My hand went instinctively to my mother's ring, twisting it around my finger. "She never stole anything," Patricia said firmly, "but she couldn't prove her innocence, and she couldn't explain why she'd been in the family's private quarters that night without telling the whole story. So she just left, came to New York and started over. But Patricia, she had a ring, the one I'm wearing now. She said it was from her grandmother, passed down through our family." "Oh, honey." Patricia's voice was sad now, full of old grief. "That ring." She told me about it years later, when she was dying. It wasn't from her grandmother. Margaret Hayes gave it to her. Gave it to her? Why would she do that? Because Margaret Hayes knew what her son had done. She was a mother, and she understood. The ring was... It was like hush money, I suppose. Margaret gave it to Eleanor along with enough money to start over in New York, but only if she promised never to speak about what had happened. The room seemed to spin around me. My mother hadn't stolen the ring. It had been given to her as payment for her silence about being assaulted by Robert Hayes Jr. And now, 60 years later, his nephew was trying to silence me before I could uncover the truth. "Patricia, what happened to Robert Jr.? "He died in a car accident in 1970, drunk driving. But he had children, grandchildren. The whole Hayes fortune is built on that family's reputation, their social standing. If it came out that one of them was a rapist," I finished, "yes, that would destroy more than just his memory. It would taint the entire family legacy." I thought about Cameron Hayes, the billionaire tech mogul who'd built his empire on investment capital, inherited from his grandmother Margaret. How much of that fortune had been inherited from Robert Hayes Sr., the real estate developer, and how much of the family's current wealth and social standing depended on maintaining their pristine public image? "Maggie," Patricia said gently, "what's this about? Why are you asking these questions now?" I told her about my encounter with Cameron Hayes, about losing my job, about his reaction to my mother's ring. As I spoke, I could hear Patricia's breathing become more agitated. "He fired you for wearing Eleanor's ring?" Her voice was sharp with indignation. "He had me fired, yes. Made up a story about inappropriate behavior." "That family," Patricia said bitterly. "They destroyed your mother's life once. Now they're trying to destroy yours, too." After I hung up with Patricia, I sat in my small apartment and tried to process everything I'd learned. My mother had been sexually assaulted by a member of one of Boston's wealthiest families. She'd been silenced with hush money and forced to start her life over. And now, 6 decades later, the current generation of that same family was continuing the pattern of silencing anyone who might threaten their reputation. but I wasn't the scared 22-year-old my mother had been. I was 57 years old. With nothing left to lose, Cameron Hayes had already destroyed my career. What more could he do to me? The next morning, I made a decision that would have terrified my mother. I was going to fight back. My first stop was the New York office of a law firm that specialized in employment cases. The consultation was free, though I suspected that would be the only part of this process that wouldn't cost me money I didn't have. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra Chen, listened to my story with professional interest. When I finished explaining what had happened at the Gilded Lily, she leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "You were fired for wearing a piece of jewelry and answering questions a customer asked you?" "That's right. But they claim I was inappropriate and invasive." "Do you have any witnesses to what actually happened?" I thought about it. The restaurant would have security cameras, and other customers might have overheard parts of the conversation. "The security footage would be crucial," Sandra said, making notes. "But getting access to it might be challenging, especially if the restaurant believes keeping it private serves their interests." She explained that wrongful termination cases were difficult to win, especially when the person being accused was wealthy enough to hire expensive lawyers. But she agreed to look into my case if I could gather more evidence about what had actually happened. My next stop was more personal. I took the subway to the Gilded Lily, not to go inside, but to wait across the street and watch the patterns of staff coming and going. I needed to talk to someone who might have witnessed my interaction with Cameron Hayes, someone who could corroborate my version of events. After 2 hours of waiting, I saw Carmen leaving through the employee entrance. I waved her over, and we ducked into a coffee shop half a block away from the restaurant. "Maggie, I can't believe what they did to you," Carmen said, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Everyone knows you didn't do anything wrong." "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you see or hear anything from my conversation with Cameron Hayes? Anything that might prove what really happened?" Carmen glanced around the coffee shop nervously, then leaned closer to me. "I didn't see the conversation, but I saw his face afterward. He looked scared, shaken up. That's not how someone looks when a server has been inappropriate with them." "Scared how?" "Like he'd seen a ghost. Like you'd said something that really rattled him." Carmen paused, considering her words. "And Maggie, there's something else. After you left that day, he came back." "Cameron Hayes came back to the restaurant?" 2 days later, he asked Lisa specifically about you. Wanted to know if you'd been completely terminated, if you were still coming around, if you'd said anything to other staff members about your conversation with him." My heart began to race. If Cameron Hayes was checking up on whether I'd been successfully silenced, that suggested he was deeply worried about something. "Did he say anything else?" "Lisa told him you were gone for good and that the staff had been instructed not to discuss the incident. He seemed satisfied with that." Carmen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Maggie, what did you two talk about that scared him so much?" I told her about my mother's ring, about the connections to his family history that I was still trying to piece together. As I spoke, Carmen's eyes grew wider. "You think he fired you to keep you quiet about some old family scandal?" "I think a lot of his wealth comes from a family fortune that was built on some very dark secrets, and I think he's terrified that those secrets might come out." Carmen was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then, "Maggie, you know Jose in the kitchen. He's been there longer than anyone, almost 15 years. He might have seen something that day, or he might know something about other incidents with wealthy customers." It was worth pursuing. Jose had always been kind to me, and his English was better than he pretended when the managers were around. If anyone might be willing to help me, it would be him. That evening, I waited outside the restaurant until Jose finished his shift. When he emerged from the employee entrance, still in his kitchen whites, I approached him carefully. "Jose, I need to talk to you about what happened with Cameron Hayes." Jose looked around nervously, then nodded toward a small park a few blocks away. We walked in silence until we were sitting on a bench under a streetlight, far from the restaurant and any potential eavesdroppers. "I heard what happened to you," Jose said, his accent thicker than usual. "It's not right. And you good person, good worker." "Jose, did you see or hear anything from the dining room that day? Anything about my conversation with that customer?" Jose was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I see many things in that kitchen, Maggie. Rich people. They think we know speak English. They think we know understand. They say things." "What kind of things?" "This man, this Hayes. He come back 2 days later, like Carmen tell you. But first time, he also talked to someone on phone. In bathroom, near kitchen. I hear him." My pulse quickened. "What did he say?" "He say, he very angry, very scared. He say, she has the ring, she knows about Eleanor. Then he say something about lawyers, about making sure you know can cause trouble." The words hit me like physical blows. Cameron Hayes had known my mother's name before I ever mentioned it to him. He'd recognized the ring immediately, and he'd been scared enough to start planning my destruction before our conversation was even over. "Jose, would you be willing to tell a lawyer what you heard?" Jose shook his head sadly. "I have family, Maggie. Wife, 3 children. I know can lose my job. You understand?" I did understand. Jose was in the same vulnerable position I'd been in for 37 years, dependent on his job, with no power to fight back against wealthy customers who could destroy his livelihood with a phone call. But at least now I knew I'd been right. Cameron Hayes had fired me not because of anything I'd done, but because of what I might discover. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research with the intensity of someone who'd finally found a purpose. I spent hours at the library searching through newspaper archives and online databases. I filed Freedom of Information requests for any police reports related to the Hayes family from the 1960s. I even drove up to Boston to search through city records and visit the neighborhood where my mother had worked. The Hayes mansion was still there, though it had been converted into condominiums. The elderly woman who lived in what had once been the servants' quarters remembered stories from previous residents about the family that had lived there. Nothing specific, but hints of scandal, whispers about inappropriate behavior by one of the sons. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through online estate sale listings, thinking I might find other pieces of jewelry that had belonged to the Hayes family, I stumbled across something extraordinary. A small auction house in Boston was selling off items from the estate of a recently deceased woman named Catherine O'Brien. Among the items for sale was a collection of letters dating from the 1960s. The listing mentioned that Catherine had been a domestic worker for several prominent Boston families, and that her correspondence included historically significant details about working conditions for household staff during the Civil Rights era. I called the auction house immediately. The letters wouldn't be available for public viewing until the week before the sale, but I could arrange to examine them if I was a serious potential bidder. I scraped together enough money for a bus ticket to Boston and told them I'd be there. The auction house was in a converted warehouse in South Boston, filled with the remnants of lives lived and lost. Catherine O'Brien's letters were kept in acid-free boxes, organized by decade. The 1960s correspondence filled 3 boxes. I didn't have to search long. In the second box, sandwiched between letters to Catherine from her sister in Ireland and recipes clipped from magazines, was a handwritten letter dated November 15, 1965. The return address made my heart race. It was from my mother. "Dear Catherine," the letter began in my mother's careful script. "I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing from New York, where I have found work in a dressmaker's shop. The pay is not as good as what we earned in Boston, but I sleep better at night." The letter went on to describe my mother's new life in New York, her small apartment, her hopes of saving enough money to marry and have a family. But near the end, she wrote about what had driven her from Boston. "I think often about what happened at the Hayes house and I wonder if I should have handled things differently. Mrs. Hayes was kind to me in the end, kinder than I expected. She understood what her son had done, even if she could never speak of it openly. The ring she gave me weighs heavy on my finger sometimes, not because it is valuable, but because of what it represents. A mother's shame, a son's cruelty, my own silence. I pray that young Robert will find peace and change his ways, but I fear for other women who might work in that house. Catherine, if you hear of any girl considering employment with the Hayes family, please warn her to be careful. Some houses are not safe for women like us. The letter was signed, "With love and prayers, Eleanor Murphy." I read the letter 3 times, my hands shaking. Here was proof, written in my mother's own hand, that Robert Hayes Jr. had assaulted her, that his mother had known about it, and that the ring I wore had been given as hush money. My mother had been forced to leave Boston, but she'd tried to protect other women by warning them away from the Hayes household. I asked the auction house staff to make photocopies of the letter, paying their fee with the last of my savings. This letter, combined with the newspaper articles I'd found and Jose's testimony about Cameron Hayes' incriminating phone call, might be enough to build a case. But a case for what? Cameron Hayes had already destroyed my career and my financial stability. What more could I hope to achieve? The answer came to me during the long bus ride back to New York. This wasn't just about getting my job back or winning a wrongful termination lawsuit. This was about justice for my mother, who had carried the secret of her assault for 60 years. This was about making sure the Hayes family couldn't continue to silence and destroy the lives of working women who threatened their carefully maintained reputation. Back in New York, I called Sandra Chen and told her about the letter. She agreed to meet with me immediately. "This changes everything," Sandra said after reading the photocopied letter. "We're not just talking about wrongful termination anymore. We're talking about a pattern of harassment and intimidation spanning multiple generations." What can we actually do with this information? Several things. First, we can file a stronger wrongful termination case, arguing that you were fired for possessing evidence of historical crimes by the Hayes family. Second, we can consider whether there are grounds for a defamation case. Cameron Hayes lied about your behavior to have you fired. Sandra paused, studying my face. "But Maggie, I have to warn you. Fighting someone with Cameron Hayes' resources is going to be incredibly difficult. He can afford lawyers who will drag this case out for years, hoping to exhaust your resources and your will to fight." "I don't have any resources left," I said. "He already took my job, my income, my reputation. What else can he take from me? Your health, your sanity, your family relationships, if he decides to make this personal?" Sandra's voice was gentle but serious. "Billionaires don't just have money on their side. They have influence, connections, the ability to make your life very complicated in ways you might not expect." I thought about my mother, forced to leave Boston and start over because she couldn't fight back against a wealthy family's power. I thought about all the women like her, women like me, who had been silenced and discarded because they didn't have the resources to demand justice. "I want to fight," I said, "not just for me, but for my mother, and for all the other women who've been hurt by people like the Hayes family." Sandra nodded slowly. "Then let's do this right. We'll need more evidence, more witnesses if possible. And we'll need to be prepared for Cameron Hayes to escalate his efforts to silence you." She was right about the escalation. Within a week of filing the initial paperwork for my wrongful termination case, strange things started happening. I began receiving calls at all hours from numbers that would disconnect when I answered. My landlord suddenly received complaints about noise and odors from my apartment, complaints that resulted in unnecessary inspections and threats about my lease. My credit card was inexplicably canceled, forcing me to spend hours on the phone with customer service representatives who claimed there had been suspicious activity on my account. None of these incidents were directly traceable to Cameron Hayes, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. He was trying to make my life difficult enough that I'd give up and go away, but I'd underestimated how much support I had from unexpected places. Carmen and several other servers from the Gilded Lily reached out to offer help, even though they risked their own jobs by associating with me. Jose, despite his fears, agreed to give a sworn statement about what he'd overheard. Even Patricia, my cousin in Boston, offered to testify about what my mother had told her about the Hayes family. And then came the call that changed everything. I was sitting in my apartment reviewing documents Sandra had sent me when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway. "Is this Margaret Murphy?" The voice was elderly, female with a refined Boston accent. "Yes, this is Maggie." "My name is Helen Bradshaw. I believe you knew my sister, Catherine O'Brien." The name hit me immediately. Catherine O'Brien, the domestic worker whose letters I'd found at the auction house. "I didn't know your sister personally," I said carefully, "but I saw some of her correspondence at an estate sale, including a letter from your mother, Eleanor Murphy." My heart began to race. "Yes. Dear, I think we need to talk in person. There are things about the Hayes family that Catherine documented, things that go far beyond what happened to your mother. Would you be able to come to Boston this weekend?" I couldn't afford another bus ticket, but I couldn't afford not to go either. "Yes, I'll be there." Helen Bradshaw lived in a tidy row house in South Boston, surrounded by the kind of neighborhood where families had lived for generations. She was in her 80s, sharp-eyed and elegant despite her age. When she opened the door, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "You have your mother's eyes," she said simply. Catherine always said Eleanor had kind eyes. Helen led me into her living room where she'd laid out photograph albums, newspaper clippings, and manila folders filled with documents. Catherine worked for wealthy Boston families for 47 years, she began. She was careful, discreet, professional, but she was also observant, and she kept records. What kind of records? All kinds. Dates when employers failed to pay wages on time, instances of verbal abuse or inappropriate behavior. Sometimes she'd take photographs of valuable items just to protect herself if anything went missing and blame was placed on the staff. Helen opened one of the photo albums. It was filled with black and white images from the 1960s, fancy parties, elegant rooms, and candid shots of wealthy families in their private moments. "Here," Helen said, pointing to a photograph dated October 1965. This was taken at a charity gala at the Hayes Mansion, just a few days before the jewelry was reported stolen. The photograph showed Margaret Hayes wearing an elaborate necklace and several rings, including one that looked remarkably similar to the ring on my finger. Standing next to her was a man in his 30s who bore a strong resemblance to Cameron Hayes. "That's Robert Hayes, Jr., Helen confirmed. Catherine took this photo because she wanted to document Margaret Hayes' jewelry collection. She'd heard rumors about valuable pieces going missing and staff being blamed." Helen turned several more pages, showing me photographs of the Hayes Mansion's interior, including detailed shots of Margaret Hayes' dressing room and jewelry collection. Then she opened one of the manila folders. "These are Catherine's notes from that period. She documented everything that happened around the time of the supposed theft." I read through Catherine's careful handwriting, feeling sick as the full picture emerged. According to her notes, Robert Hayes Jr. had a pattern of inappropriate behavior with female staff members. Several young women had left their employment suddenly, and Catherine had witnessed Margaret Hayes making special payments to at least 3 of them. But the most damning evidence was a photograph Catherine had taken of Margaret Hayes' jewelry collection after the alleged theft was reported to police. The photo was dated October 20th, 1965, 5 days after the theft was supposedly discovered. In the image, most of Margaret Hayes' jewelry was clearly visible in its display case, including several pieces that had supposedly been stolen. Catherine believed the theft report was fabricated, Helen explained. A way to discredit Eleanor. and make sure she couldn't speak publicly about what Robert Jr. had done to her. But why would Margaret Hayes participate in covering up her own son's crimes? Because in those days, a scandal like that would have destroyed the entire family's social standing. Margaret helped her son cover up his assaults, but she also tried to make amends to his victims in her own way. The ring, the money to start over, it was guilt as much as hush money. Helen showed me more documents, more photographs, more evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-ups that had lasted for years. By the time Robert Hayes Jr. died in 1970, at least 6 young women had left their employment under suspicious circumstances. Why didn't Catherine ever come forward with this information? I asked. Who would have believed her? A working-class Irish woman against one of Boston's most prominent families. But she kept it all, hoping that someday someone would be able to use it to seek justice. That someone, it seemed, was me. Helen packed all of Catherine's documentation into boxes for me to take back to New York. As I prepared to leave, she took my hands in hers. Your mother was a brave woman, dear. Braver than she knew. She protected other women by warning them about the Hayes family, even when she couldn't protect herself. I wish she'd lived to see this, I said, thinking about how my mother had carried the weight of her assault in silence for 60 years. She is seeing it, Helen said gently, and she's proud. Back in New York, Sandra Chen's eyes grew wider as I showed her Catherine O'Brien's documentation. This is extraordinary, Maggie. We're not just talking about your wrongful termination anymore. We have evidence of a decades-long pattern of sexual assault and cover-ups by the Hayes family. What can we do with it? We can file an amended complaint that includes charges of intentional infliction of emotional distress and conspiracy to suppress evidence of historical crimes. More importantly, we can use this documentation to put pressure on Cameron Hayes to settle out of court. I don't want to settle quietly, I said. I want the truth to come out. Sandra studied me carefully. The truth coming out publicly would destroy Cameron Hayes' reputation and potentially cost him billions in business relationships and investment partnerships. Are you prepared for how hard he'll fight to prevent that? Before I could answer, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized. The Gilded Lily. Maggie. It was Carmen, and she sounded frightened. You need to know something. Cameron Hayes was here again today asking questions about you, but this time he had people with him, men in suits who didn't look like lawyers. What kind of questions? He wanted to know where you lived, if you had family, if you'd been in contact with any lawyers or journalists. Lisa told him she couldn't give out that information, but Carmen's voice dropped to a whisper. Maggie, I think he's trying to find you. A chill ran down my spine. Carmen, be careful. Don't tell anyone at the restaurant that we've been in touch, okay? I won't. But Maggie, maybe you should think about staying somewhere else for a while, just until this thing with the lawsuit gets resolved. After I hung up, Sandra looked at me with concern. Maggie, Carmen might be right. If Cameron Hayes is escalating to intimidation, you might not be safe in your apartment. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have money for a hotel, and I can't ask friends to put themselves at risk. There are women's shelters, safe houses for people in situations like this. The idea that I might need to hide from a billionaire because I'd worn my mother's ring to work seemed surreal, but the fear in Carmen's voice had been real. And if Cameron Hayes was desperate enough to send people to find me, he might be capable of more than just economic harassment. That night, I packed a small bag and went to stay with my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who'd always been kind to me. I explained that I was having some troubles with my former employer without going into the full details. She offered me her couch without asking questions, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the building made me jump. Every car door slamming outside made me wonder if someone was coming for me. The power dynamic that had always existed between people like me and people like Cameron Hayes had never felt so stark. He had unlimited resources, unlimited connections, unlimited power to make my life miserable. All I had was the truth, and sometimes the truth wasn't enough. The next morning, Sandra called with news that made my stomach drop. Maggie, Cameron Hayes' legal team filed a countersuit against you yesterday. They're claiming defamation, harassment, and extortion. They're asking for damages of $10 million. $10 million? It might as well have been $10 billion. I could never pay that kind of judgment, even if I worked for the rest of my life. What does this mean? It means they're trying to scare you into dropping your case. It's a common intimidation tactic with wealthy defendants. They bury you in legal costs and threaten you with financial ruin, hoping you'll give up and go away. Can they actually win a $10 million judgment against me? Probably not if we can present our evidence effectively. But fighting it will be expensive and time-consuming, and in the meantime, having that lawsuit hanging over you will make it very difficult for you to find employment or housing. I felt the walls closing in around me. Cameron Hayes wasn't just trying to silence me, he was trying to destroy my life completely. Make me an example of what happened to working-class women who dared to challenge the wealthy and powerful. But that afternoon, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment staring at the legal papers for the countersuit when my phone rang. The number was blocked again. "Is this Margaret Murphy?" The voice was male, older, with a slight Southern accent. "Yes." "My name is James Walker. I'm an investigative journalist with the Boston Globe. I understand you have information about the Hayes family that might be of interest to the public." My heart began to race. "How did you get this number?" "I have sources who keep me informed about interesting legal cases. Your wrongful termination lawsuit against Cameron Hayes caught my attention, especially when I saw his countersuit filing. $10 million is a lot of money to claim in damages from a waitress, unless she has information that's particularly threatening." I was quiet for a moment, trying to decide whether I could trust this stranger with the story that had already cost me so much. "Ms. Murphy, I've been investigating the Hayes family for 3 years. There have been rumors about historical misconduct, but no one has ever been willing to come forward with documentation. If you have evidence of wrongdoing by that family, the public has a right to know." "What kind of investigation have you been doing?" "Business practices, political connections, historical irregularities in how the family fortune was accumulated, but also patterns of behavior dating back decades. Your mother's name has come up in my research." That decided it. If James Walker already knew about my mother, then others might be investigating the Hayes family as well. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this fight as I'd thought. "I think we should meet in person," I said. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop in Cambridge, far from any locations where Cameron Hayes might have connections. I spent the night copying Catherine O'Brien's documents and organizing my evidence into a coherent timeline. James Walker was a man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, the look of someone who'd spent years investigating stories that powerful people didn't want told. When I showed him Catherine O'Brien's photographs and documentation, his professional composure slipped. "Jesus Christ," he said softly, studying the photographs of Margaret Hayes's jewelry collection taken after the supposed theft. "They used false police reports to silence assault victims?" "And it worked for 60 years, I said, "until I wore the wrong ring to work." "Maggie, can I call you Maggie? This story is bigger than just your wrongful termination. This is about systematic abuse of power, about wealthy families using their influence to cover up crimes. This is the kind of story that brings down dynasties." "But can you publish it? Won't the Hayes family's lawyers try to stop you?" "They'll try. But the Boston Globe has resources to fight legal challenges, and we have First Amendment protections. If we can verify this evidence and present it responsibly, we can publish the truth." Over the next 2 hours, I told James Walker everything. About my mother's letter, about my encounter with Cameron Hayes, about the pattern of retaliation I'd experienced since filing my lawsuit. He took careful notes and asked detailed questions, treating my story with the respect and seriousness it deserved. I'm going to need to verify as much of this as possible, he said. Interview other sources, check public records, maybe track down some of the other women who worked for the Hayes family. How long can you give me? As long as it takes. I'm not going anywhere. But Cameron Hayes apparently had different plans. The next evening, as I was walking back to Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment from the grocery store, a black sedan pulled up beside me. 2 men in expensive suits got out. "Ms. Murphy, we'd like to have a word with you." Everything in my body screamed danger. "Who are you?" "We represent Mr. Cameron Hayes. He'd like to resolve this matter privately without the need for prolonged litigation." "You can contact my lawyer." One of the men stepped closer. "Mr. Hayes is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement in exchange for your agreement to cease all legal action and refrain from discussing your allegations publicly." "How substantial?" $2 million, tax-free, deposited in any account of your choosing within 24 hours of signing the agreement. $2 million. More money than I could earn in multiple lifetimes of serving tables. Enough to buy a house, to travel, to never worry about money again. All I had to do was sign a paper agreeing to never speak about what Cameron Hayes' family had done to my mother. I need time to think about it. "Mr. Hayes hoped you'd be able to make a decision today. The offer has an expiration date." "How long do I have?" 24 hours. The men got back in their sedan and drove away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with shaking hands and a mind racing with possibilities. $2 million to stay quiet, or years of expensive litigation with no guarantee of success while fighting someone who had unlimited resources to make my life miserable. When I told Sandra Chen about the settlement offer, she was quiet for a long moment. "It's a generous offer, Maggie. More than we could hope to win at trial, even if everything went perfectly. But taking it means Cameron Hayes wins. He silences you the same way his family silenced your mother, and he gets to continue his life without any consequences for what he's done. What if I take the money, but still help the journalist with his story? The settlement agreement will include strict non-disclosure clauses. If you violate them, you'll have to pay back the money plus penalties, and Cameron Hayes will sue you for breach of contract." That night, I lay on Mrs. Rodriguez's couch and stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the most difficult decision of my life. $2 million represented security, freedom from financial worry, the ability to help my grandchildren with college expenses. But it also represented surrender, accepting that people like Cameron Hayes would always win because they had more money and power. I thought about my mother, carrying her secret for 60 years, about all the other women who'd been silenced by the Hayes family's money and influence, about the possibility that Cameron Hayes might continue to destroy the lives of anyone who threatened him. In the morning, I called the number the men had given me. "This is Margaret Murphy. I've made my decision about Mr. Hayes' settlement offer." "Excellent. We can have the paperwork ready within an hour." "I'm declining the offer." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ms. Murphy, perhaps you didn't understand the full terms. $2 million is a substantial sum." I understood perfectly, and my answer is no. May I ask why? Because some things are more important than money, like justice, like the truth. When I hung up, I felt simultaneously terrified and liberated. I'd just turned down more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, but I'd also chosen to fight for something bigger than myself. Sandra was both impressed and worried when I told her about my decision. "You realize this means Cameron Hayes is going to escalate his efforts to silence you? I'm ready for whatever he throws at me." I wasn't, of course. Nobody could be ready for the systematic campaign of harassment that began within hours of my refusing his settlement offer. My credit score was mysteriously devastated by false reports of missed payments and defaults. My bank account was frozen due to suspicious activity that took weeks to resolve. My apartment lease was terminated by my landlord, who claimed to have received credible complaints about illegal activities in my unit. But James Walker's investigation was making progress. He'd tracked down 2 other women who had worked for the Hayes family in the 1960s and early 70s. Both confirmed stories similar to my mother's: inappropriate behavior by Robert Hayes Jr., sudden termination of employment, and gifts from Margaret Hayes that had bought their silence. More significantly, Walker had found records suggesting that Robert Hayes Jr.'s death in 1970 might not have been as accidental as initially reported. Police records indicated he'd been drinking heavily and driving erratically in the hours before the crash, but there were also reports of an argument with his mother earlier that day. Margaret Hayes had called police to report her son's erratic behavior, then canceled the call 20 minutes later. It's possible Margaret Hayes finally reached her limit, Walker told me over the phone. Maybe she threatened to cut him off financially or expose his behavior unless he sought help. The crash happened just hours after witnesses heard them arguing at the family estate. Are you suggesting she might have driven him to suicide? I'm suggesting that a mother who spent decades covering up her son's crimes might have finally decided to stop enabling them. Whether Robert Jr.'s death was accidental, suicidal, or something else, we'll probably never know, but the timing is significant. Walker's story was scheduled to run in the Sunday edition of the Boston Globe, front page, above the fold with the headline, "Tech Billionaire's Family Legacy, Built on Decades of Cover-Ups and Abuse." He'd given Cameron Hayes' representatives 48 hours to provide comment, but they'd declined to respond. But Cameron Hayes had one more card to play. On Friday evening, 2 days before the story was scheduled to publish, I was served with a temporary restraining order. Cameron Hayes claimed that I had been stalking him, making threatening phone calls, and engaging in a campaign of harassment that threatened his safety and the safety of his family. The restraining order required me to stay at least 500 feet away from Cameron Hayes, his residence, his businesses, and any location where he might reasonably be expected to be present. Violating the order would result in immediate arrest, but the most devastating part of the order was a clause requiring me to cease all communication with journalists, lawyers, and media outlets regarding Cameron Hayes or his family. The judge had been convinced that my public statements posed a threat to Hayes' reputation and business interests. Sandra Chen was furious when she saw the restraining order. This is a clear abuse of the legal system, using a domestic violence protection mechanism to silence someone in a civil dispute. Can we fight it? We can appeal, but it will take weeks or months. And in the meantime, if you violate any part of this order, you'll be arrested. I called James Walker to warn him about the restraining order, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When I tried calling the Boston Globe's newsroom, I was told he was unavailable for comment. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez showed me the local news. The lead story was about how the Boston Globe had pulled a scheduled investigative piece due to concerns about source credibility and potential legal liability. James Walker had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review of his reporting methods. I felt like I was drowning. Cameron Hayes had used his wealth and connections to silence the journalist, manipulate the legal system, and isolate me from anyone who might help tell the truth. I had no job, no income, no home, and now no way to fight back without risking arrest. But I'd underestimated the power of community, the network of working women who'd been watching my story unfold with recognition and anger. The next morning, Carmen called me with news that made my heart soar. "Maggie, you need to see what's happening at the restaurant." She sent me photos taken outside the Gilded Lily. Dozens of servers, kitchen workers, and other restaurant employees were walking in a circle with handmade signs. "Justice for Maggie. Billionaires can't buy silence. Working women deserve respect." The protest had started with just Carmen and a few of my former co-workers. But word had spread through social media to servers and hospitality workers throughout New York City. They were on strike, refusing to serve customers who supported the kind of treatment I'd received. "It's not just our restaurant," Carmen told me. "Workers at 6 other high-end places in Manhattan walked out too, and more are joining every hour. I watched live streams of the protests on my phone, tears streaming down my face. These women and men were risking their own jobs to demand justice for me. They were facing the same power dynamic I'd struggled with, the vulnerability of depending on tips and customer approval, but they'd decided that some things were more important than personal security. The protests got media attention that Cameron Hayes couldn't suppress. Local news stations interviewed striking workers who told their own stories of harassment and abuse by wealthy customers. Social media lit up with Kiswani Justice for Maggie posts from service industry workers across the country sharing their experiences of being dismissed, degraded, and silenced. By Monday morning, the story had gone viral in ways that Cameron Hayes' money and lawyers couldn't control. My face was on morning talk shows. Labor organizers were calling for boycotts of businesses that didn't protect their workers from customer harassment. Several other women came forward with their own stories about encounters with Cameron Hayes that had made them uncomfortable. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Helen Bradshaw, the elderly woman who had given me Catherine O'Brien's documentation, appeared on CNN with boxes of additional evidence she'd been holding back. "I didn't want to overwhelm Maggie with everything at once," she told the interviewer. "But after watching how this young woman has been treated for trying to seek justice for her mother, I think the public needs to see the full scope of what the Hayes family has done." Helen had photographs, letters, and documents dating back to the 1940s, showing a pattern of abuse and cover-ups that spanned 3 generations of Hayes men. Robert Hayes Sr. had used his real estate development business to exploit immigrant workers and silence complaints about unsafe working conditions. Robert Hayes Jr. had assaulted multiple women and used the family fortune to buy their silence. And now Cameron Hayes was continuing the family tradition of using wealth to avoid accountability. "This isn't just about one waitress or one billionaire," Helen said. "This is about a system that allows wealthy people to destroy the lives of anyone who threatens their carefully constructed image." The CNN interview was watched by millions of people. By Tuesday morning, "Your Hayes Family Secrets" was trending on Twitter. Investigative journalists from major news outlets were calling Helen Bradshaw, requesting access to Catherine O'Brien's complete archives. Several women's rights organizations announced they would be providing me with legal support pro bono. Cameron Hayes tried one last desperate move to maintain control of the narrative. His publicist announced that he would be holding a press conference to address the false allegations and provide context for the current media circus. The press conference was held at a high-end Manhattan hotel, with Cameron Hayes standing behind a podium flanked by expensive lawyers. He looked polished and confident as he began his prepared remarks. "The recent media attention surrounding my family has been based on distorted facts and the accusations of a disgruntled former restaurant employee," he said. "While I sympathize with Ms. Murphy's financial difficulties, her claims about my family history are simply false." But then something unexpected happened. A reporter from the audience stood up with a photograph, one of Catherine O'Brien's pictures showing Margaret Hayes wearing the complete jewelry collection that had supposedly been stolen in 1965. "Mr. Hayes, can you explain why your grandmother was photographed wearing jewelry that had allegedly been stolen days earlier? And why police reports about the theft were never followed up with arrests or recovered property?" Cameron Hayes' confident demeanor cracked. He looked to his lawyers, who whispered urgently in his ear, "I'm not going to dignify false allegations with detailed responses," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Another reporter stood up. "Mr. Hayes, we've reviewed employment records from your grandmother's household staff. At least 8 women left their positions suddenly between 1963 and 1970, and several received unusually large severance payments. Can you comment on why your family paid substantial sums to former employees who were allegedly dismissed for theft or misconduct?" The questions kept coming, each one more specific and damaging than the last. Cameron Hayes tried to maintain his composure, but the evidence against his family was overwhelming. Finally, one of his lawyers stepped to the microphone and announced that Mr. Hayes would not be taking any more questions. But as Cameron Hayes turned to leave the podium, a woman in the back of the room stood up. I recognized her immediately. It was Patricia, my cousin from Boston, holding a photograph I'd never seen before. "Mr. Hayes," Patricia called out in a voice that carried across the room, "do you recognize this photograph of your uncle Robert Jr. with my cousin Eleanor Murphy, taken at a Christmas party at your grandmother's house in December 1964? The photograph showed my mother, young and smiling, standing next to Robert Hayes Jr. Her face was bright with the kind of innocent happiness I'd never seen in later pictures. His hand was on her waist, positioned just a little too low, a little too possessively. Cameron Hayes stared at the photograph for a long moment, his face pale. Then he turned and walked out of the press conference without saying another word. That night, I watched the news coverage from Mrs. Rodriguez's living room, surrounded by supporters who'd come to check on me throughout this ordeal. Carmen was there, along with Jose from the restaurant kitchen, Sandra Chen, and even James Walker, who'd been reinstated at the Boston Globe after his editors had reviewed Helen Bradshaw's additional evidence. "It's over," Sandra told me. "Cameron Hayes' legal team called this afternoon to discuss a settlement that doesn't require any non-disclosure agreements. They want to make this go away before any more evidence comes to light." But I wasn't interested in settlements anymore. The truth was already out there, spreading through news outlets and social media faster than any amount of money could stop it. Other women were coming forward with their own stories about the Hayes family and other wealthy families who'd used their power to abuse and silence working women. 6 months later, I was back in a restaurant, not as a server, but as the manager of a new cooperative restaurant owned and operated by hospitality workers. We served good food at reasonable prices, treated our staff with dignity, and had a strict policy about customer behavior. No amount of wealth could buy the right to abuse our workers. The ring I'd inherited from my mother still sits on my finger, but now it means something different. It's not just a reminder of her pain and silence. It's a symbol of the justice she never lived to see. The ring that caused Cameron Hayes to recognize a secret his family had tried to bury became the key that unlocked decades of covered-up crimes. Cameron Hayes' business empire didn't survive the scandal. Major investors pulled out when the full extent of his family's history became public. Several corporations canceled lucrative contracts, citing concerns about being associated with the Hayes name. His cryptocurrency holdings lost most of their value when market confidence collapsed. Within a year, his net worth had dropped from $2 billion to less than $50 million. Still wealthy by most standards, but no longer wealthy enough to buy silence and avoid consequences. More importantly, the Hayes family story became a catalyst for broader conversations about power, privilege, and accountability. Several states passed laws making it easier for workers to report harassment and abuse without fear of retaliation. Restaurant industry organizations developed new training programs about treating staff with dignity, and dozens of other families with similar secrets found that their wealth could no longer guarantee their crimes would stay buried. The woman who had been invisible for 37 years, who had served coffee and cleared tables while wealthy people discussed their fortunes without ever seeing her as a human being, had finally been seen. Not just seen, but heard, believed, and supported by a community that refused to let her fight alone. My mother's secret had been buried for 60 years, but secrets have a way of finding the light when the time is right. Sometimes justice comes through the courts, sometimes through the media, and sometimes through the simple act of refusing to stay silent when powerful people demand your complicity in their lies. As I lock up the restaurant each evening and walk to the subway station, I think about all the women like my mother, like me, who serve others while carrying their own pain in silence. I think about the moment when staying silent becomes more painful than speaking truth, when protecting others becomes more important than protecting yourself. The ring on my finger catches the light from the subway entrance, and I remember my mother's hands, always busy, always serving, always giving more than she received. But now I also remember Helen Bradshaw's words. Your mother was braver than she knew. She was. And so was I. And so are all the women who refuse to let wealth and power write the final chapter of their stories. Have you ever worked for someone who made you feel invisible, who treated you as if your dignity didn't matter because you needed the job? Have you ever carried secrets that weren't yours to carry, stayed silent when speaking up felt impossible? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your experience deserves to be heard. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who serves with dignity and deserves to be seen. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with stories just as moving. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. I'll see you in the next story.